Hey guys, this is a quick recap of what we talked about in class today. So we started off by doing a brief writing where I asked you, because today was an introduction to argument, and argument is a key way of talking in the university. You're always going to be called upon to make some sort of argument, so I wanted us to talk about that a bit today. We started talking about asking you to define argument. Do you like to argue? What do you like to argue about? And what kind of arguments do you avoid? Because even some folks who say they like to argue still try to avoid certain arguments. And even people who say they never like to argue probably like to argue about a thing or two. We had a good discussion about that, and we tended to say that we would prefer not to argue about politics and religion. So I then showed some examples from a Google search of the word argument, just to try to think through how our culture at large views argument. And a lot of these images, as you'll see, have somewhat of a negative connotation to it, or an obviously negative connotation to it. This is a picture of then President Obama and then Governor, now Senator Mitt Romney in the 2012 presidential debates. And we talked about how, in this instance, neither one of the men are looking at each other because they're not the audience, really. The audience are those people out there in television land that are watching this and are trying to be persuaded by this. So we have these two guys, and then we had another image. This is definitely a very combative image of argument, and yet something that we've seen in our culture. Our culture currently has the Karen phenomenon, although that's gendered towards women. There are men who do the exact same thing. We had a fun discussion about this, about who was wrong, and that was interesting. But again, you're seeing this combative nature that our culture often gives to the term argument, and understandably so. Here is a little bit of wisdom. Remember, you don't have to attend every argument you're invited to. The world of sports certainly provides several examples. Who's right there? I don't know. Here's another couple, and you can see that they are baring their teeth at each other like dogs, basically, being angry with one another for sure. Oftentimes people make a distinction between debate and argument, suggesting that debate is the more civil of the two, and argument is the less civil, the one. Here you see them using words against each other. We say that, but actually if you go back to the first image with which we started, the political one, that is a civil discussion, but it is not a search for truth that's going on there. It's a search for political points. Even nature sometimes has some level of argumentation that goes along with it. So the point I wanted to stress in this class was that argument in an academic sense can be and should be viewed positively. We should view it positively, maybe idealistically, as something not to be avoided. An argument in this sense isn't a fight, it isn't a quarrel, it isn't a pointless debate. There's something much more positive that's going on with it. A positive argument, or argument viewed positively, is something that justifies its claims. It makes a point and then backs it up with adequate evidence. It is both a process and a product. That's not that important of a point, but it just means that you'll be asked to produce a argument, which could be a paper, it could be a speech, it could be cardboard cutout. I can't think of the word, but anyhow, something like that. But you go through a process to get there. A positive argument, or argument viewed positively, seeks truth and seeks to persuade. And a positive argument can be both implicit and explicit. So that led then to a discussion about explicit and implicit and what is the difference between the two. You can see those stated up here on the slide. Explicit is something that's directly stated. The argument is directly stated. Implicit is where the argument is implied but not directly stated. I did want to make this point, as I did in class, that an implicit argument is not a lesser type of argument. It's not a weaker form of argument. Oftentimes, implicit arguments make as strong a point as an explicit argument does. So neither one is better than the other. They're just two ways of arguing, or two ways of arguing. Let's go with that. So then we looked at some examples and discussed in class about looking at the theme of stopping war, about whether or not these were explicit or implicit. Again, there's going to be a mixture of that, right? The line isn't just hard, fast. There is, in all these images I'm going to show you, there's some explicit and there's some implicit argumentation or connotation that's going on here. This one we probably tended to. So I'm just going to show these, and you make your own decision about whether or not you think the topic of stopping the war, whether these particular images are more explicit or implicit. So the first one, I'm not particularly sure which war they're talking about. Sometimes I apologize, I don't have a context always for these images. This was kind of interesting because it uses basically it uses the same color palette as the first one, the Stop the War, right? Red, black, white. This has red, black, and I guess you would call that white. Both of them use hand motifs, but there's a very different idea to them. This one we talked about how the red is definitely talking about blood, but this one might also have a blood reference to it, but that doesn't seem to be its primary meaning. This next image is a historic, iconic piece of American advertising that has been changed for the purpose of making an anti-war statement. So death is behind this particular image, which is Uncle Sam in the original iconic image. Yeah, so is that more explicit or implicit? This is from the Vietnam War with President Nixon. And then the last image that we looked at was one that takes place in a British context. I'm not actually, it's post-World War I, it must be pre-World War II, but I'm not entirely sure. Labour is one of Great Britain's major political parties. We then looked at this, and I'll let you look up these links. You can look it up. It's very powerful. You can listen to, it's Chris Eccleston, something like that. There's an actor who has a beautiful accent that reads the poem we're going to look at, Wilfred Owen. This is an example of an implicit argument. I want you to read this poem if you would, because it's an example of an implicit argument, and it really makes the point about how powerful an implicit argument can be. Wilfred Owen was a British poet. He dies in 1918. He dies 1 week before the First World War ends. He wrote poems in the trenches, and his poetry is quite moving. The one that we looked at in class is Dulce et Decorum Est, and you can see here the image of the poem that he wrote. And I always love seeing what other writers write, their original works. You can see how they have to cross things out, that no one gets it perfect on the first round. So that should give us all some sort of hope. But anyhow, this is a very famous poem. Look it up, read it, and what you're going to see is there is some explicit nature to this. I'm sorry, the language is explicit, but the argument is implicit. All he does is powerfully depict a battle scene where people are being gassed, poison gas, and the horrors of that. And that really gets across his anti-war message. He does it with an implicit argument, not an explicit argument, though he does use really graphic, moving language. So that's what we talked about in class. Make sure you read Wilfred Owen. He's amazing.